I want to tell you about a door I built 40 years ago and never got to hang. That sentence sounds like the beginning of a complaint. It isn't. Stay with me, because before this hour is finished, that door is going to mean something different to you than it does right now, and so will at least one door in your own life. The one you don't talk about, the one you check on some mornings just to see if, by some miracle, it opened overnight. My name doesn't matter for this. What matters is that I have spent my working life around doors, building them, fitting them, sanding down the swollen edges every spring when the wood remembers the rain and refuses to close right. A door is a strange piece of furniture, if you think about it. It is the only object in a house whose entire purpose is to be crossed. A table exists to hold things. A chair exists to hold you. A door exists to be walked through, and yet most of the doors and most of the buildings I have worked on spend 99% of their existence simply shut. I want you to sit with that a moment, because I think it is the truest thing I know about the subject we are here to talk through together tonight. A shut door is not a broken door. It is not a door that has failed at its job. Shut is simply the resting state of every door that has ever been built. Open is the exception. Open is the moment. Shut is the 99%. We don't live like we believe that, though. Most of us live as if shut is the emergency and open is the normal. And so when a door in our life won't move, the job, the marriage, the child who won't call back, the diagnosis that won't lift, the calling you've felt for a decade that has never once cracked open, we treat it like something has gone wrong with the universe. Like the hinge is broken. Like somebody forgot to build the doorway at all. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, and I'd love for you to actually answer it down in the comments, because I read every one of them and I think this particular question deserves an honest answer rather than a polite one. What is the door in your life that has stayed shut the longest? Not the one you're worried might close, but the one that's already closed, that you've been standing in front of for months or years, waiting for the sound of the latch giving way. Type it down there. You don't have to explain the whole story. Even one word will do. I read them, and more than that, I think naming a thing out loud, even to strangers on the internet, does something to the weight of it. And while you're there, if this is the kind of thinking you want more of in your life, subscribe, so the next one finds you. Not because the channel needs the number. Because I think there are a few of us out here trying to think clearly about waiting instead of just tolerating it, and it helps to not do that thinking alone. Alright. Let's get into the wood grain of this thing. I learned early in the trade that timber has a memory. You can cut a plank, plane it smooth, hang it as a door, and paint it, and 5 years later, in a wet November, it will swell along exactly the line where the tree it came from once had a knot, because that's where the fibers run differently. That's where the tree itself, decades before you were born, healed over some old wound or old branch. Wood remembers where it has been hurt. It swells there first. It's the last place to dry out after rain. I think doors that won't open are like that sometimes. Not always. I want to be careful here, because I don't believe every closed door in your life is closed because of some old wound in you, and I am deeply suspicious of anyone who tells you with total confidence why God is doing what He's doing in your particular circumstance. But some of the time, yes, a door stays shut longest exactly where we were wounded earliest, because that's where the grain runs different, that's where things swell first and dry last. But that is not actually the main thing I want to say tonight, and I don't want to let us settle into it too early, because there is an older, larger, and I think far more comforting truth underneath it, and it comes from a door I did not build. Nobody living built it. It was built, according to the story, by one very old man and his 3 sons over the span of about a century, out of gopher wood, sealed with pitch inside and out, on dry land, nowhere near an ocean, while the neighbors watched and, presumably, laughed. I'm talking about Noah's door. And I want to spend some real time here, because I think we have turned this story into a cartoon, into rainbow wallpaper for a nursery, and in doing that we have lost the one detail in it that actually answers the question this whole hour is built around. Here is the detail. Genesis, chapter 7. The animals have come in, 2 by 2, 7 by 7 of the clean ones, the family is aboard, the ark is loaded and provisioned, and the earth outside is still bone dry. And then the text says something that should stop you every single time you read it, and mostly doesn't, because we read past it the way you walk past a piece of furniture you've had in the house so long you no longer see it. It says, "And the Lord shut him in." Not Noah shut the door. Not Noah's sons pulled it closed, and Noah checked the latch 3 times because he was the nervous type. The Lord shut him in. Think about what that means practically, for one moment, stripped of all sentimentality. It means Noah did not get to decide when the door closed. He had spent 100 years building toward this moment. He had cut the wood, coated the pitch, endured what must have been a small city's worth of mockery from people who watched an old man build a boat on dry ground for the better part of a lifetime. And when the moment finally came, the moment he had worked his entire life toward, the actual shutting of the door was not his to perform. It was done to him. He was, in the most literal sense available to the language, shut in. I want to sit in that detail rather than rush past it, because I think it holds the hinge, forgive me, the actual hinge of everything we're circling tonight. We tend to assume that if a door in our life is closed, it must be closed because we did something wrong, or because we haven't yet done the right thing to earn it opening, or because our faith isn't sufficient, or our timing was off, or we missed some signal we should have caught. But here is a door, the most consequential door in the history of the human race, a door on the other side of which literally every remaining human being and animal on earth would live or perish, and the man on the inside of it, the man who built it with his own hands, did not close it himself. Somebody else's hand was on that door. And Noah, as far as the text tells us, said nothing about it. There's no recorded protest. No recorded prayer of, "Wait, not yet, let me check the sky again." He built what he was told to build, entered when he was told to enter, and then the text simply moves the agency away from him entirely, as if to make unmistakably clear, the timing of this door was never his to manage. It was his to trust. And then, and this is the part that I think we skip past even faster than the shutting, nothing happened for 7 days. Look at the sequence again. The animals come in. The family comes in. The Lord shuts the door. And then, according to Genesis 7 verse 10, after 7 days the waters of the flood were upon the earth. 7 days of sitting inside a sealed wooden box, on dry land, under a clear sky, having already said goodbye to the only life you'd ever known, having already burned every bridge back to normalcy, and nothing visibly happening. Can you imagine those 7 days? I have tried, working alone in my shop some evenings, to actually imagine them, and it unsettles me every time. Noah is 600 years old. His sons are grown men with wives. They have sealed themselves into a wooden vessel the size of a small ocean liner, built at unthinkable personal cost, on the word of a God who had spoken to Noah directly and who had, this is important, already shut the door himself, meaning the moment of external confirmation, the moment when the whole household could look at each other and say, "Yes, this is really happening. The God who told us to build this has now personally sealed us inside it." That confirming moment had already come. And gone, 7 days before the first drop of rain. What do you do with 7 days like that? What do you do on day 3, when you have already had the confirmation, the door is shut, this is real, and yet the sky outside is still that same maddening, cloudless blue it's been for 100 years? I imagine there were long silences in that ark on days 2 and 3 and 4. I imagine Noah's sons, practical men who had spent years hauling timber and pitch, running out of things to check and recheck. I imagine, if I'm honest, at least one of them wondering, quietly, whether they had made a catastrophic and irreversible mistake, not because the sign hadn't come, but because the sign had come, and the world had, impossibly, gone on being ordinary anyway. This is the shape of nearly every closed door I have ever watched someone I love walk through in real life, and possibly the shape of the one you are walking through right now. It is not usually the case that we are waiting with no confirmation at all. Often we've had the confirmation. We felt the call. We heard the word. We built the thing we were told to build, at real cost, in front of neighbors who thought we were foolish for building it. And then the doors shut, some decision was made, some season ended, some chapter sealed itself closed with a finality we did not orchestrate. And now we are sitting in the belly of that decision, on dry land, under a clear sky, waiting for a rain that has not yet started to fall, wondering on day 4 whether the sign we already received was ever really a sign at all. I don't have a tidy answer for the 7 days. I don't think the text wants us to have one. I think the 7 days are left in the story precisely so that everyone who ever reads it, across every generation, in every language it gets translated into, has to sit for a moment in the exact discomfort we are sitting in tonight, the discomfort of being sealed into a decision, with the confirming word already spoken, and still, somehow, having to wait. But I want to draw your attention to something the text does that I think is almost too quiet to notice on a casual read. The waiting in the ark was not waiting for God to decide something. God had already decided. The door was already shut. The waiting was not suspense about the outcome. It was simply the natural interval between a true thing being settled and a true thing becoming visible. That distinction changes everything, if you let it. Most of the anguish in a long closed door comes from treating the waiting period as though the outcome itself is still undecided, as though God is up in the clouds deliberating, weighing whether to let the rain start, weighing whether your circumstance deserves relief, and your job is to somehow tip the scales through enough faith or enough patience or enough correct behavior. But that is not what is happening inside a shut ark. Inside a shut ark, the decision has already been made and sealed. What's happening during the 7 days is not deliberation. It's development. The clouds are gathering somewhere Noah cannot yet see them. The waters under the earth are already beginning to shift, the text tells us, breaking open the fountains of the great deep, a phrase, incidentally, that describes something happening below ground, invisible, structural, long before a single drop fell from the sky. The change was already underway. It simply had not yet reached the surface where anyone inside the ark could perceive it. I think a great many of the doors that stay shut longer than we expect are like that. The decision is not still pending somewhere in heaven, waiting on our performance to tip it. Something is already moving, underground, structurally, in places we cannot see, and the delay we experience is not God's hesitation. It's the natural lag between a thing being true and a thing being visible. There's a piece of the craft I haven't mentioned yet, and I think it belongs here before we leave the ark. Good timber is not ready the day it's cut. Any joiner worth the name will tell you that freshly felled wood is nearly useless for fine work. It's full of moisture, it moves unpredictably, it will warp and crack the moment you try to make something exacting out of it. Before it can become a door, it has to be seasoned. Stacked, spaced, left alone in a dry place for months, sometimes years, so the moisture leaves it slowly, evenly, without splitting the grain. There's no way to hurry this honestly. You can force dry wood with heat, and sometimes that's necessary, but forced wood is brittle wood. It looks finished before it actually is, and it tends to fail exactly where you needed it most, under the stress it was supposed to be built to handle. The wood that holds for 100 years is almost always the wood nobody was in a hurry about. I think Noah's century of building is best understood this way, rather than as some test of endurance for its own sake. 100 years is not an arbitrary number chosen to make this story more impressive. It is, among other things, exactly the kind of interval that seasoning requires, not of timber only, but of a household, of a family's habits, of the kind of steady, unremarkable faithfulness that cannot be manufactured quickly no matter how badly you want it. By the time the door actually closed, Noah's sons had grown up inside a family that built without needing applause and prayed without needing evidence. That doesn't happen in a season. It happens the way seasoning happens, slowly, in a dry place, mostly unnoticed, until one day the wood that used to be a green and unpredictable log turns out to be exactly strong enough for the one job it was always going to be asked to do. If your door has been closed for longer than you expected, I want to gently suggest that some of what feels like delay might, in fact, be exactly this: not punishment, not oversight, but seasoning. Not every long way to seasoning. I don't want to hand you a tidy explanation for every hard year of your life. But some of it is. Some of what feels like nothing happening is actually moisture leaving slowly, evenly, from places in you that would have split if it had been forced out any faster. Let me leave the ark for a moment, because there's a second door I want to set beside it, a door on the opposite side of Scripture, centuries later, in a very different key. And I think the contrast between these two closed doors is where the real teaching sits. Turn with me, if you have a way of following along, to the 16th chapter of Acts. Paul is well into his second missionary journey by this point. He has already seen extraordinary things: churches planted, a jailer converted, cities changed. He is, by any reasonable measure, a man with momentum, a man whose doors have generally been swinging open in front of him. And then the text gives us one of the strangest short sentences in the entire New Testament. They were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. Forbidden. Not merely delayed. Forbidden. By the Holy Spirit, no less, not by persecution, not by bad weather, not by a hostile city council, but by the very Spirit that had been directing Paul's steps up to that point. Paul, a man on a divine assignment, tries to go somewhere with the gospel, and God himself closes the door. He tries again. He and his companions attempt to go into Bithynia instead, a reasonable pivot, a sensible next move, and the text says, almost casually, the Spirit did not allow them. 2 attempted doors. 2 closures. Not because Paul lacked faith. Not because Paul had sinned or drifted or lost his nerve. The most missionally effective man in the early church, walking directly into 2 consecutive closed doors, by direct divine intervention, in the span of a single chapter. I want you to notice something about how differently this door closes compared to Noah's. Noah's door was shut with total silence. No explanation given, no destination named, just a hand closing a hatch and 7 days of waiting in the dark about what came next. Paul's doors are shut with almost violent clarity. The text names exactly what's happening. Forbidden, did not allow. And yet the destination is, for a while, just as unclear to Paul as it was to Noah. He knows precisely what door is not opening. He has no idea yet what door is. That's a particular flavor of hard that I think doesn't get talked about enough. There is the heart of ambiguous closure, where you don't know whether the door is really shut or just being slow. That's Noah's 7 days. And there is a different heart, which is knowing with total certainty that the door is shut by the highest authority available, shut without appeal, and still not knowing what you're supposed to do with the rest of the evening. Paul isn't confused about whether Asia is open. He's completely clear that it isn't. What he doesn't have is the next thing. So what does he do? This is worth slowing down for, because I think it's the most practically useful verse in this entire narrative, and it gets read past constantly. Acts 16 verse 8. So, passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. That's it. That's the whole verse. No agonizing described. No extended prayer meeting recorded, though I have no doubt there was one. Just, they kept moving in the general direction available to them, toward the coast, toward the edge of the map they had, because a closed door in one direction does not obligate you to sit down in the road. It just tells you that direction is not the direction. Paul does not know where he's going. He knows where he's not going. So he walks toward the sea, which is the only geography left that hasn't yet said no to him. And it's at Troas, not before, not during the deliberation, but specifically at the edge, at the place where the land runs out and the only remaining direction is water, that the door finally opens, and it opens as a vision in the night, a man of Macedonia, standing, pleading, "Come over and help us." I want to be honest about something here, because I think false comfort is worse than no comfort at all. The gap between the forbidding in Asia and the vision at Troas is not specified in the text. We don't know if it was days or weeks. Some scholars think it may have covered real distance and real time, crossing a significant stretch of Asia Minor on foot, region by region, door by door, each one closing in turn, before Troas. I don't want to promise you that your version of this gap will be short, because I don't know that, and neither does anyone making a video about it. What I want to point out instead is the posture Paul held during the gap. He did not stop moving. He did not stop preaching where he could preach. He did not sit down in Mysia and declare his ministry over because 2 doors in a row had shut on him. He kept walking toward the only opening left visible, geography, not certainty, and let the vision arrive on its own schedule, at the edge of the map, when he had gone as far as the map allowed. Here, then, are 2 closed doors, sitting side by side in Scripture, and I think holding them together teaches something neither one teaches alone. Noah's door was closed by God to protect what was already inside it. The closing itself was the mercy, sealing his family off from a catastrophe about to fall. Paul's doors were closed by God to redirect what was already moving. The closing was not protection from a coming disaster in Asia, as far as the text tells us, but simple redirection toward Macedonia, where the actual assignment was waiting. 2 different reasons for the exact same experience, a door not opening when you expected it to. Sometimes the closed door in your life is a hatch sealing you in against a flood you cannot see coming, and its refusal to open is itself the rescue. And sometimes the closed door in your life is simply a wrong turn being blocked, not because catastrophe waited beyond it, but because your actual assignment is 2 towns over and God is walking you there one shut door at a time, the way you'd guide someone through a house in the dark by touching the walls that aren't the door, so they know not to bother reaching for them. The trouble, and I think this is the honest, uncomfortable center of tonight's whole subject, is that from inside the waiting, Noah's door and Paul's door feel absolutely identical. There is no sensation available to a human being, standing in front of a door that will not open, that tells you which kind of closed door you're in. You cannot feel the difference between being protected and being redirected. Both feel, from the inside, like being stopped. I think this is exactly why so many of us become bitter or bewildered during long closures. And I don't say that as a criticism. I say it because I think it's simply true, and naming it honestly is more useful than pretending otherwise. We want to know, while we're waiting, which kind of closed door we're standing at, so we can calibrate our response correctly. Relief if it's Noah's kind, patience if it's Paul's kind. But that information is almost never available in real time. It tends to become clear only in hindsight, only once the water has actually risen outside the ark, or the vision has actually appeared at the edge of the map. Which means, practically, that the only posture that works for both kinds of closed doors, the only stance flexible enough to be right whether you're being protected or redirected, Is trust extended before the category is known? Not trust because you've figured out which kind of door this is. Trust instead of figuring it out. Trust is a substitute for the diagnosis you cannot make. I want to step outside the workshop and outside the text for a few minutes and tell you about someone I knew, because I promised myself I wouldn't fill this hour with story after story, the way some of these videos do, stacking one anecdote on another until the actual thinking gets buried under a pile of tidy little arcs. I'm going to tell you about exactly one person, and then we're going back into the wood grain of the thing. There was a man, a farmer, who I knew for a stretch of years in a dry part of the country, the kind of place where the whole economic and emotional life of a family runs on whether rain comes in a particular 6-week window in spring. He had lost his wife 2 years before I met him, to a long illness, the kind that gives you time to prepare and somehow that only makes the grief stranger, not lighter. And the year I'm thinking of, the rain simply didn't come. Came late. Didn't come. Week after week of the same flat white sky, the ground cracking in long shallow fissures across fields he'd worked his entire adult life. And this man, I remember this clearly, kept doing the same 3 things every single morning regardless of the sky. He checked the equipment. He walked the fence line. And he prayed, out loud, alone, standing at the edge of his driest field, for maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and then he went back to work as though the prayer had already been answered rather than just sent. I asked him once, toward the end of that stretch, how he kept doing that, how he kept walking out to a field that had disappointed him for 11 straight weeks, and praying over it like it was the first week rather than the 11th. And he said something I have never forgotten, not because it was clever, but because it was so plain it felt almost too simple to be as true as it turned out to be. He said, "I'm not praying because I think today's the day it rains. I'm praying because this is still my field, rain or not, and a man ought to tend what's his whether the sky's cooperating or not." The rain came, eventually, in the 13th week, later than any year he could remember, late enough that the yield was smaller than usual but not ruined. And I don't tell you this to suggest that every long closed door resolves with the crop coming in just barely in time, because I have known other closed doors, in other people's lives, that did not resolve that way at all, that stayed shut, that never opened this side of what any of us can see. I tell you this instead because of what he said about tending the field regardless of the sky. I think that's the difference between waiting well and merely waiting. Waiting badly is standing at a shut door doing nothing but staring at the handle. Waiting well is tending what is actually yours to tend, the fence line, the equipment, the 4 minutes of honest prayer, while the door does whatever the door is going to do on its own schedule, which was never yours to set to begin with. I said I'd give you exactly one story and then move on, and I meant that, but I want to add one more sentence to it, because I think it belongs here rather than standing alone. Years later, after I'd lost touch with him for a while, I heard that his daughter, grown by then, married, living 3 states away, had named her first child after her father's own father, a small family gesture that had nothing whatsoever to do with rain or fields or waiting. And I remember thinking, when I heard it, that this was probably closer to the actual shape of how these long closures resolve than any single dramatic answered prayer could be. Not one door swinging open with fanfare, but a whole life's worth of faithful tending quietly producing fruit in a direction nobody was watching for, years after the field itself had stopped being the center of the story. There's a small pair of details before that, the raven and the dove, that I think are easy to skip past entirely, and I don't want to skip past them, because they show something about how Noah himself handled the uncertain stretch between the rain stopping and the ground actually drying. He doesn't simply sit and wait for a sign to arrive on its own. He sends the raven out first, and the raven, the text tells us, goes to and fro until the waters dry up, not a clean resolution, Not a clear answer, just a bird flying back and forth, checking, returning, checking again, over what was probably weeks. Then he sends the dove, and the dove comes back the first time because it can find nowhere to land. He waits 7 more days. There's that number again, and sends it a second time, and this time it returns with the olive leaf. He waits 7 more days after that and sends it a third time, and this time it doesn't come back at all, which is itself the final piece of information he needed. I find it moving that Noah's method for reading a closing door wasn't a single dramatic revelation but a patient, repeated, almost mundane process of sending something small out again and paying attention to what came back. He didn't demand certainty all at once. He tested gently, waited the appropriate interval, tested again. I think that's a truer picture of how most of us actually get confirmation that a long closed door is finally beginning to move than the instant, unmistakable sign we usually picture when we imagine it. More often it looks like sending the raven out, and watching it circle uncertainly for a while. More often it looks like a dove returning empty twice before it returns with anything at all. The absence of an immediate, thunderclap answer is not evidence that nothing is happening. Sometimes it is simply what the process of a door slowly opening actually looks like from the inside, before the olive leaf, before the third silence that finally tells you it's safe to look outside for good. Let's go back to the ark for one more moment, because there's a detail near the end of the flood story that I think completes the whole picture, and it's a detail almost nobody preaches on, because it doesn't fit the tidy arc we usually want these stories to have. The rain stops. The waters begin to recede. Noah sends out a raven, then a dove, and eventually the dove comes back with an olive leaf, and everybody, understandably, wants the story to end right there, with the leaf in Noah's hand, because that's the moment that feels like triumph. But the text keeps going for a while longer, and it includes this. Noah removes the covering of the ark and looks out, and the ground is dry. And then, according to Genesis 8 verses 15 to 16, Noah still does not leave. God has to speak again. Go out of the ark. A second instruction, separate from the first, required before Noah, dry ground visible with his own eyes, actually walks through the opening. I find that detail almost unbearably tender, once you notice it. Here is a man who has weathered the single largest catastrophe in recorded history, sealed inside a wooden vessel for over a year by the time all of this concludes. And even once the door is functionally open, even once he can see with his own eyes that the ground outside is dry, he waits for a second word before he steps through. Not out of excessive caution, I don't think. I think it's closer to this. A door that stayed shut that long teaches a kind of reverence toward its own opening. Noah does not treat the first sign of daylight as permission to charge back into ordinary life. He has learned, through the length of the closure itself, to wait for the actual invitation rather than assuming his own reading of the circumstances is sufficient. I think that is worth sitting with if you are currently watching a door begin to move after a very long stillness. A job offer finally surfacing, a relationship finally softening, a health report finally turning, a calling finally finding its first small foothold after years of nothing. The temptation, understandably, is to sprint through the moment it cracks open, because you've waited so long you don't want to waste a single hour of the daylight now visible. But I wonder if some of what a long closure is meant to produce in us is exactly what it produced in Noah. Not impatience to leave the moment the ground looks dry, but a settled willingness to wait for the actual word, even at the very threshold, even with your hand already on the door. I want to say something now about what a closed door does to a person over time, because I don't think it's honest to talk about all of this as though the waiting itself is costless, as though the only point is theological accuracy about God's reasons. It isn't costless. A door that stays shut past the point you expected it to move does something to the way you hold hope itself. It teaches a kind of caution around your own future that can, if you're not careful, calcify into something closer to numbness. I have watched people, good people, faithful people, grow so tired of hoping for a particular door that they quietly, almost without noticing the moment it happened, stopped hoping for it at all, and called that stopping acceptance, when it was really something closer to grief wearing acceptance's clothes. I don't think Scripture asks us to avoid that grief. I think it asks us, instead, to keep it honest, to let it be grief rather than letting it curdle into either bitterness on one side or false cheerfulness on the other. The Psalms are, frankly, far more comfortable with unresolved waiting than most of our modern worship music is. Psalm 13 begins with 4 consecutive how longs. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? And does not resolve those questions with an answer. It resolves them with a decision. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. Not. And then I understood why. Not. And then the door opened. Just a decision, made in the middle of the still closed door, to trust anyway, sitting right next to the honest confession that the waiting has been long enough to feel like abandonment. I think that's a more truthful map of long waiting than most of what gets produced for public consumption on this subject. Real trust, biblically speaking, does not require the resolution of the how long. It sits down next to the how long, and refuses to leave, the way you'd sit next to a friend in a hospital waiting room, not because you know how the surgery will turn out, but because leaving isn't the kind of thing love does. I want to say something about time itself here, because I think part of why closed doors wound us the way they do has less to do with theology and more to do with something almost physical in how we're built to experience duration. There's a strange feature of human memory and expectation. We are very bad at estimating how long we can bear something before we're actually inside it, and very good, once we're inside it, at forgetting that we ever thought it would be shorter. Ask someone in week 2 of a long wait how long they expected it to last, and they'll often tell you, with total sincerity, some number far smaller than what has already elapsed. This isn't foolishness. It's simply how hope works when it's healthy. It estimates conservatively, because a mind that assumed the worst-case duration from the outset would never have had the courage to start waiting at all. Noah did not build for 100 years by first calculating that it would take 100 years and steeling himself for the whole span. I doubt anyone could carry a 100-year expectation consciously for 100 years. He almost certainly built one season at a time, the way most durable things get built, and only in hindsight does the length of it become visible as a single, continuous span. This matters for you tonight because if your door has stayed shut past whatever number you privately expected, the miscalculation is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It's evidence that you're a person who hoped honestly rather than defensively. The alternative, expecting the worst-case timeline from day one so you're never disappointed, is not wisdom. It's a kind of preemptive surrender dressed up as realism, and I don't think it's what Scripture asks of us anywhere. The Psalms don't model that kind of guarded, pre-grieved waiting. They model surprised waiting, waiting that keeps being startled by how long, turns out to mean, and keeps choosing to trust anyway, freshly, each time the surprise lands. There's also something worth naming about what long closure does to the imagination specifically, distinct from what it does to hope in general. A door that has stayed shut for years has a way of shrinking your sense of what's even possible on the other side of it. I have watched this happen to people I love. The longer a particular door stays shut, the smaller and more modest their private picture of what opening it would even look like becomes, as if some part of the mind quietly renegotiates the dream downward every year, just to keep the gap between hope and reality from feeling unbearable. It's a survival mechanism, and I don't think it's a moral failure. But I do think it's worth noticing in yourself, because a vision that has been shrunk down to feel safe is not the same as a vision that has been fulfilled. And sometimes when a long closed door finally does open, part of the difficulty is relearning how to want something at full size again, after years of practicing wanting it small enough not to hurt, and I want to handle it carefully. Because I think it's true in a limited sense, and dangerously false in an unlimited one. The phrase is some version of, "When God closes a door, He opens a window." I understand the impulse behind it. It's meant to be comforting, to suggest that closure and opportunity are always paired, that scarcity never has the last word. But I don't think it's actually the pattern Scripture shows us, and I worry that leaning on it too heavily sets people up for a particular kind of disillusionment when the window doesn't appear on the schedule they were promised. Look again at the two doors we've spent this hour inside. Noah's door did not come with a window. For over a year, there was no alternative opening, no consolation prize, nothing but the one sealed door and the weight inside it. And Paul's doors in Asia and Bithynia did not come with immediate windows either. There was a gap, unspecified, possibly substantial, of walking through closed territory before Troas appeared. In either case, does the text promise a tidy compensating opening on any predictable timeline? What both stories actually show is something a little less marketable but, I think, considerably more durable. The door that is shut for reasons rooted in a character we are invited to trust, not a formula we are entitled to expect. Not, "A closed door always means a window is coming." Something quieter and sturdier. The one who shut this door is the same one who was faithful in the ark and faithful on the road to Troas, and he has not changed. I want to bring the workshop back in for a moment, because there's a practice in my trade that I think maps onto all of this more precisely than any metaphor I could invent for the purpose. When a door won't close properly, when it's swollen, or the frame has shifted with the settling of the house, or the hinges have worn slightly out of true, there is a wrong way to fix it and a right way, and almost everyone's first instinct is the wrong way. The wrong way is to attack the door itself, plane down the swollen edge, shave off wood until it fits the gap that's currently there. It works in the short term. But wood keeps moving with the seasons, and a door plane to fit this month's humidity will rattle loosely in a dry month and jam again in a wet one, because you've solved the visible symptom instead of the actual cause, which is almost always in the frame, or the foundation beneath the frame, settling in ways that have nothing to do with the door at all. The right way, the way that actually lasts, is slower and less satisfying in the moment. You check the frame. You check the hinges. Sometimes you check the foundation of the whole house, because a door that won't close on the second floor is sometimes telling you something true about a support beam in the basement, something far below the level where the actual complaint originated. I think we do the wrong way version of this constantly with the closed doors in our lives. We attack the door itself. We assume the fix is entirely at the level of the door, try harder, network more, pray a different prayer, adjust our approach, plane ourselves down until we fit whatever gap currently exists. And sometimes that is exactly the right response. I don't want to overcorrect into a passivity that pretends effort is never called for. But I wonder how often the actual issue is not at the level of the door at all, but somewhere in the frame, in the timing of a whole season of your life, in the settling of relationships or circumstances around you that have nothing directly to do with your effort or your worthiness, in a foundation being laid, invisibly, below the floor where the door sits. That simply has to finish settling before that particular door will ever hang true. I want to stay with the foundation a moment longer, because there's a particular kind of job I used to dread taking, and I think it teaches something useful here. Every so often someone would call about a door that had started sticking on the top corner, just the top corner, nowhere else, and ask for a quick plain job, something they could pay for and forget about in an afternoon. And every so often, when I went out to look, I'd find that the sticking door was the smallest and least important symptom of something much larger. A foundation corner settling unevenly because of poor drainage decades old, water finding its way under a footing year after year, so slowly that no single season showed any change at all. The homeowner never noticed the foundation. Nobody notices a foundation. You notice a door that won't close, because that's the part of the house you touch every day. But the door was never the problem. The door was simply the part of the house sensitive enough, and public enough, to be the first place the deeper issue became visible to a human hand. I think this is worth sitting with honestly, because it complicates the neat metaphor I offered earlier without ruining it. Sometimes, yes, a stuck door really is telling you the truth about something structural and slow-moving that has nothing to do with your effort or your worth, a family history, an economic season, a relational pattern generations deep, moving underneath your life the way groundwater moves underneath a house, invisible, patient, indifferent to your calendar. But here's the part one wants to be careful about. Noticing that the sticking door points to a deeper foundation issue is not the same thing as being able to fix the foundation yourself, on your own timeline, through sheer diagnostic clarity. Some settling has to finish settling. Some water has to finish finding its final level. You can underpin a foundation. It can be done, I've watched it done. But it is slow, expensive, unglamorous work, performed mostly in silence, mostly out of sight, by people whose names never end up on any plaque, and the homeowner, for a long while, simply has to trust that the crew working under the house knows what it's doing, even though all the visible evidence, every single morning, is still just a door that won't close. I don't offer this to make you feel smaller in front of your own closed door. I offer it because I think there's a real comfort available here that the quick-fix version of faith doesn't have room for. If your door has been shut a long time, it may be less useful to keep asking, "What am I doing wrong that this hasn't opened?" And more useful to ask, "What is being repaired beneath the floor that I was never going to be able to see from up here anyway?" Not every long wait is foundation work. But some of it is, and it deserves to be treated with the patience foundation work actually requires, rather than the impatience appropriate to a door that just needs its edge planed down 1/8 of an inch. This is, I think, the quiet gift hidden inside both Noah's story and Paul's story, and it's the thing I most want you to leave with tonight if nothing else survives the hour. In both cases, the delay was not a referendum on the person waiting. Noah's faithfulness was not in question during those 7 silent days. Paul's calling was not in question during the walk toward Troas. The delay was structural. It was happening in the foundation, in the frame, in the invisible fountains of the deep breaking open somewhere below the ark, in the geography and timing that had to align before a man in Macedonia would even exist yet to have the dream that summoned Paul across the water. None of that delay was a verdict on Noah's or Paul's worth, their obedience, or their faith. It was simply the frame still settling. If a door in your life has stayed shut longer than you expected, and I suspect, if you've watched this far, that there is one, specific, named, sitting somewhere behind your ribs right now while I talk about carpentry and old boats, I want to offer you something more durable than false comfort and less demanding than a formula. I don't know whether your door is Noah's kind, sealed for your protection against something you cannot yet see, or Paul's kind, held shut so that your feet will be in the right place when the actual assignment finally shows itself at the edge of the map. I genuinely don't know, and anyone who claims certainty about your specific circumstance from outside it is claiming more than they can actually see. What I do know is that both kinds of doors were opened, eventually, by the same hand that closed them, on a timeline that made sense once the whole picture became visible and made almost no sense at all while it was still unfolding. And I know that the posture available to you in the meantime is not resignation, and it is not frantic striving. It's tending what's yours to tend, the fence line, the equipment, the 4 honest minutes, while trusting a frame you cannot see finish settling beneath a floor you can. Before we close, I want to ask you a second question, different from the first one. because I think it gets at something the first question didn't quite reach. Not, what door has stayed shut the longest? You've already told me that, some of you, down in the comments, and I've read them, and I'm grateful for the honesty. This time I want to ask, what is the one thing you have kept tending, quietly, faithfully, even while that particular door has refused to move? The fence line you keep walking. The prayer you keep praying even though it's stopped feeling like it's landing anywhere. I think that answer matters more than the first one, honestly, because it's the place where your actual character is being formed right now, whether or not the door ever opens on the schedule you choose. Write it down in the comments if you're willing. And if this kind of thinking is useful to you, if you'd rather sit with a hard question honestly than be handed an easy answer that doesn't survive contact with real life, subscribe, and share this with the one person you know who is standing, right now, in front of a door that hasn't moved in longer than they expected. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do for someone in a long wait is simply let them know somebody else has thought carefully about the shape of it too. I never did hang that door I mentioned at the start of all this, all the way back before we talked about wood graying and swollen hinges and the strange ordinary fact that most doors, most of the time, simply stay shut. The house it was built for burned, years before I finished the fitting, in a fire that had nothing to do with the door and everything to do with old wiring nobody had thought to check. I kept the door anyway. It's leaned up against the back wall of my shop for 4 decades now, through I don't know how many winters, never swollen shut because it's never been asked to close against the frame at all. Some nights, working late, I look over at it and think it's the strangest kind of monument, a door that outlived the house it was meant for, still sound, still square, still perfectly capable of doing the one thing a door is built to do, just waiting, all this time, for a frame that never came. I used to think that was a sad story. I'm not sure I think that anymore. I think it's closer to this. Some of what we build in faith is not wasted just because the door we built it for never opened the way we expected. The craftsmanship still counts. The years of learning to work the wood still counts. And who's to say? I'm an old man now, and I've stopped assuming I understand the full timeline of anything. Who's to say that door won't find its frame yet, in some use I haven't imagined, before I close this shop for the last time? For tonight though, the lantern's low and the shop's cold, and I'm going to do what I do most nights at this hour. I'm going to walk the length of the workshop, check that the tools are put away where they belong, and then I'm going to close the shop door behind me, not because I've finished everything I set out to do, not because every unfinished door in here has found its frame, but because tending what's mine to tend today is enough for today, and the rest of it, the frame still settling somewhere I can't see. The fountains of some deep still breaking open beneath a floor I'll never get to look under. The rest of it was never actually mine to manage in the first place. Whatever door you're standing in front of tonight, however many mornings you've checked the handle and found it exactly where you left it the day before, I hope you'll let it be enough, for today, simply to tend what's actually yours, the fence line, the 4 honest minutes, the next right thing sitting quietly in front of you. The door is not stuck because you did something wrong. Some doors simply stay closed longer than we expect, and are opened, in the end, by the same hand that shut them, on a day, and at an hour, that only that hand has ever really known. I think, if I'm honest, that door leaning against my back wall has taught me more standing still than most of the doors I've actually hung and hinged, and watched swing open on schedule. There's a kind of instruction that only comes from something unfinished, something that never got to do the one thing it was built for, in the way it was supposed to do it, on the timeline anyone expected. I used to think that was the door's failure. I've come to think it might be closer to its patience, a patience I didn't build into it on purpose, but that the waiting itself produced, the way 7 days in a sealed ark produces something in the people inside it that the finished journey afterward never could have produced on its own. Thank you for spending this hour in the shop with me. I'll leave the lantern on a little longer than usual tonight, in case any of you want to sit here a while more before you go.